I did not know, but every day since the day that my sister got to the Home of Grace, she went to every chapel and she would ask them to pray for me. And she would pray that God would put it on my heart to get sober. And so little did I know that it was God speaking for me and doing for me what I could not do for myself.
Let's be honest about recovery.
The rewards, the challenges.
Let's talk about our failures.
We are flawed people, after all.
Let's challenge the stigmas that weigh us down.
Because while most of us are looked at,
Few of us are seen.
Let's talk about addiction.
And how Christ overcomes our weaknesses.
Because we are loved.
because we are
We
loved.
are
Because
loved.
we are loved.
We are loved.
We are
Because
loved.
we are loved.
Hey, my name is EC and this is my story. I began drinking at the age of 13 to numb the pain of watching my father slowly die from the horrible disease of ALS. For the next 16 years, my ability to control my drinking began to diminish as the disease of addiction grew stronger. Although I began drinking to numb the pain of all of the hurt that I had, the hurt continued to grow and my anger began to grow as well. In 2017, at the age of 29, by divine appointment, I checked myself into the Home of Grace in Mobile, Alabama. It was at the Home of Grace that I found freedom from addiction in Jesus, and I have never looked back.
Welcome back to the Jesus Loves Addicts podcast. I'm Kathryn, and this is my co-host, Paul.
Welcome back.
Today, we're going to be speaking with EC. EC Simmons is a 36-year-old mother to a feisty 4-year-old little redheaded boy. For years, EC used alcohol to drown her problems, but only to realize that alcohol had become a much bigger problem than she was prepared to handle. And today, we're going to hear more about it. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
So we're going to ask that you tell us your story in your words, and we'll more than likely interrupt.
All right.
All right.
Abruptly and at the worst possible times.
Yes. Yes. It'll be him first.
Let's see. I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi. It was me and my sister, Kimberly. She's 4 years older than I am. We had a pretty great life, picture perfect. My father was an attorney. My mom stayed home with us. And then when I was in third grade, my whole life fell apart. We found out that my father was sick. We didn't know at the time. They thought it was Lyme's disease, and then later found out that it was Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS. Later found out, actually didn't find this out until a couple years ago. My mom said when they went to the doctor and found out what it was, he came back in there and he said, "Do you have small children?" And they said yes. And he said, "Well, you'll never be able to see your children grow up."
Oh, my goodness.
And so over the next 5 years, my dad slowly declined. It started, he was very active, played golf, hunted all the time, did everything, was very involved in our life. And it was just slowly, everything was taken away from him. It was, he couldn't walk anymore. At first he had to have a cane, and then he had to have a wheelchair, and then eventually a wheelchair that held his head up, feeding tube, all that. So in the 8th grade is when he passed away. Actually, the last place that he went in public was my sister's high school graduation, and he died a month later at home. But we had the best family. We had the best support system. There was nothing that my mom or dad could have done any different,
Right.
that would have changed the outcome of myself or my sister and what happened to us. Unfortunately, we just chose the wrong things. And I began drinking when I was 13. So like 7th grade, when my dad was really sick. My mom was always taking care of my dad. And so she didn't really have time to pay attention to what I was doing.
Right.
And my sister was in high school. So I kind of played along with that and I could get away with a lot. So I started drinking, never really had a problem with it in high school, drank on the weekends. And then when I went to college, it was like, oh, heck yeah. Like this is freedom. Like I didn't have, like, my mom wasn't strict or anything like that. I had everything. I got to do everything. It wasn't that, but it was just a different, I can drink 7 days a week and people around here think it's normal. Like, you can find a different group of friends drinking every day of the week in college, especially in Starkville, Mississippi. It's just what you can do. And so I began drinking, still going through the motions. I was not a bad student. There was some bad grades, but overall I was a pretty good student until later on. And then I just remember now I can say, looking back, I can look and see when alcohol, that turn
on you.
Kind of where alcohol where I could no longer control the alcohol and it controlled me. It was like I had to drink to go to sleep. I was staying up all night studying. Well, most people would stay up all night just studying. I was drinking while I was studying. It was just slow things that I can now look back and see, like, whoa, alcohol, it was already a big enough problem then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I stayed in college at Mississippi State for a couple of years. And then
Before you leave college, which so you're raised in this wonderful family, and then you said, so there was nothing they could have done. We just made bad choices. But those choices have to be presented to you. So would you say that, I guess, and it almost seems obvious, but I want to ask it, was this just about the peers that you surrounded yourself with? Is this where you got introduced to all the other stuff? It was about the people outside of the home.
Yeah, it was. I mean, growing up, like my grandmother, my mom's mother, was an alcoholic. She passed away at 50. So it was in our genetics. That train stops here, no more generational curses on this family.
Amen.
So we knew that, and we did know that, but it was the peers, it was my friends, and, especially like boys always do things faster than girls. So I hung out with a lot of guys, and it was just, we would get it from our parents or go to somebody's house and they would steal it from their parents or get it from older siblings or whatever it may be. But yes, it was peers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So then I guess it was 2000. I graduated from high school in 2006. So my timelines are a little messed up, but I stayed at State for 3 years. And then my grandfather got a brain tumor. He had a glioblastoma. And I called my father Daddy, and my grandfather was Dad. I always get kind of emotional.
Sure.
Both of my grandfathers were the greatest things in the whole world. They really became fathers to me after my dad died, and there was nothing that they wouldn't do for any of us. So when my grandfather got sick, it was really tough, and so eventually I decided to take off a semester from school and go to Jackson and be at home. And I said I would go back. I went to a semester at Mississippi College in Clinton because I was in Jackson, and then I just never went back. During this whole time, I was very fortunate. I worked for a law firm in Jackson. I started when I was a senior in high school working for them. And they became like family. I ended up working there for 9 years.
Okay.
So I had stability along the way. Now, I would say stability, but I was always late for work. They gave me, I should have been fired like 15 times. But
you had a lot of grace for your instability.
I had a lot of grace. One of my bosses joked that they would tell me that I started to work at 8, so I'd be there by 10 when I was really supposed to be there. But yes, I had a lot of grace. But all that time I was working. And then, so when I took off that semester of college, I had a job and I was still working there. And then I could help my grandmother with my grandfather and all that kind of good stuff. And it was just good for me to be closer to home. Dad passed away in January of 2013. And that was pretty tough. It was like the second man in my life was gone. And then my other grandfather also had a traumatic brain injury. He fell and hit his head, and it was a rough couple of years, and he passed away in August of 2015.
Mm-hmm. And how old are you at this time?
I was, well, I'm 36
Math is
now,
not my
so I
strong
was,
suit.
yes, math is not my strong suit. I was like 24.
Young 20s.
24. So 24, my second grandfather died. During that time, I had been in a relationship with somebody. It was not a good relationship. It was a toxic relationship.
Mm-hmm.
We drank all the time. It was just not good. But
was this all primarily just alcohol?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I say that, and then no, I was on every kind of prescription you could be on, like antidepressants, Xanax, Adderall, anything that you could get a prescription for that would alter your mood. I had a prescription for it. I actually, after my grandfather passed away, the first one, so Dad, I mixed Xanax and alcohol for the first time. And it was like, whoa. This is
something.
Yeah, this is like, talk about numbing. Like, this can completely numb you. And I actually accidentally overdosed. I told my friend, I was texting her. She worked, she's my best friend. She worked at the hospital at the Children's Hospital in Jackson. And I actually texted her and I said, I think I took too much. And I don't know what's going to happen. And the next thing I know, I woke up in the hospital with a tube down my throat. And if it hadn't been for her,
you would not be here.
I would not be here, because she had enough sense to call me and to know that I wasn't answering, and that was not like me. Even if I was belligerently drunk, you know, she could have still gotten in touch with me, and she couldn't. So she called the ambulance, and then she called my mom, and they got me. But yeah, I woke up with a tube down my throat, and that was the first time that it was really like, this is a different level of numbing that I'm used to. But I had like I said, I had a prescription for just about anything.
Were you, and pardon the looseness of this, right? But were you playing the doctors? I mean, did you know what to say to get those prescriptions?
My psychiatrist was one of my dad's best friends. So I feel like I played him. But then there's also parts of me like, why would a psychiatrist give a child all of these things?
It is mind-boggling.
And I don't blame him at all. That's just the field that they're in, and that's what they're taught to do. But,
Amen.
You know, I had a prescription for the maximum amount of Xanax that you can have. And then I do remember trying to, you know, I was like, early on, I was like, you know, how do I get off this? Like, I don't want to take this forever. And they're like, well, you can't just stop taking it or else you'll have seizures. And, you know, you can die from withdrawals from taking this. And I'm like, so you put me on a medicine to help me, but now that can kill me.
That you can't stop taking.
Yeah, that I can't stop taking. And so I would say that for me, it was more the downers that I liked. It was the depressants that I liked.
Well, because you were after, as you put it, the numbing.
Yeah.
Right.
I never really liked, I mean, I partied a lot in college. You know, I would say that I experimented with a bunch of different stuff, and it was fun to party and stuff. But at the end of the night, it was whatever, you know, the next morning, whatever. I was always trying to find something to bring me back down. I didn't like the highs. I liked the lows.
I'd like to take a moment to recognize a major podcast sponsor. Today's episode is brought to you by America's Thrift Stores, your go-to option for decluttering and giving back. You have a closet bursting at the seams or a garage that's seen better days? We've got the perfect solution for you.
That's right. America's Thrift Stores makes it easy to clear out the clutter and make a positive impact in your community. Whether you are cleaning out your wardrobe, downsizing your living space, or just looking to give back, America's Thrift Stores has you covered.
And here's the best part. You've got options. Schedule a hassle-free home pickup, drop off your items at one of their convenient donation sites, or swing by an America's Thrift Store to donate in person. No matter which way you choose, you're making a difference.
Every donation you make to America's Thrift Stores directly benefits charities in your area, such as the Home of Grace and other fantastic organizations dedicated to helping those in need.
For example, donations made to America's thrift stores in southern Mississippi help the Home of Grace provide support and assistance to individuals facing drug and alcohol addiction. Your contributions make a real impact on their mission to provide freedom from addiction through Christ-centered recovery. So, not only are you decluttering your life, but you're also helping build a stronger and more supportive community.
It's truly a double blessing. So what are you waiting for? Clean out that closet, clear out that garage, and make a positive difference in your community by donating to America's thrift stores.
Visit America's Thrift Stores online to schedule a home pickup, locate a donation site near you, or get directions to one of their store locations.
America's thrift stores, where giving back never goes out of style.
So you'd mentioned that you were in a toxic relationship. So you're using all these substances to numb. Would you lump relationships in there as well? Or did you use relationships to kind of, do you feel as though we can be addicted to relationships, right? I mean, do you feel like that was a part of it or?
So in a lot of ways, I kind of feel like I didn't like relationships in the fact that I kind of saw how my sister always had to have a boyfriend and I didn't want to be like that.
Okay.
So I kind of steered away. In college, I had a long-term relationship for 7 years, and I ended up messing that up. My alcohol ended that relationship. It was not the best relationship, but my addiction and eventually ended that. And then the second relationship that I was in, the long-term one, we both drank and partied and everything. We decided together to quit drinking and stuff. And that's when my grandfather got sick. I was outside of Hattiesburg and I was going back and forth to Jackson a lot. And so I was up there and I would drink and party and stuff like that. And my boyfriend at home, he never knew, what was going on. And then actually the day of my grandfather's funeral, I texted my then boyfriend and he said, I've moved your stuff out of the house. So the day I'm burying my grandfather, I don't have a house anymore. I don't know what I'm going to do with my life. And I don't have a job in Jackson anymore. So I would say that was the first low, like not rock bottom, but low that I felt like.
No answers, no idea what to do next.
And I didn't have my two grandfathers anymore. Yeah. I could go to them and ask them for anything. And within reason, they were going to get it. They had been my saviors for so long.
Yeah.
So you said your boyfriend was largely unaware of what was going on, the partying and the drink. So, but yet he's moving your stuff out. Was your using, whether he knew it or not, knew the source of your behavior, it was negatively affecting that relationship then?
I mean, it was a train wreck to begin with.
Okay.
Was he able to stop? I was curious about that when you said y'all both made the decision together.
For a time being, yes. Okay. He comes back into the story a little bit later.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, I would say that we decided to quit. It was more like let's get healthy type thing, not like we have a problem. We probably need to stop drinking. So yeah, but definitely that was what ultimately led to a big blow up and a disaster. So after that, I say that 2015 was the beginning of the end. After that, I moved back to Jackson. I lived with my grandmother for a short period of time. That woman, bless her. She just...
Is this your mom or your dad's mom?
This is my dad's mom.
Okay.
My Mimi. She's the greatest person ever. But she let me move back in with her, and it was just... she tried to control my drinking by saying I could have a glass of wine at dinner, and she would joke and say, I said one glass, not a constant glass, like poured out of the bottle, like one big glass, it's things like that. But I got a job. I had a couple of different jobs, but at that point, I couldn't hold down a job. I was late. I got fired. I had a couple of different here and there jobs. And then I eventually started in the service industry because my ex's family had owned a restaurant. And so I was a waitress, so I knew how to do that. And if you know anything about the service industry, they don't care what you do as long as you show up. And so that's what I did. And I was waitressing, double shifts. I would wake up in the morning, get there in the morning. In between shifts, I would go to the bar across the street, drink, taking, at that point, it was a vicious cycle.
Mhm.
I knew how much Xanax I had to take the next day to not get hungover. And I knew how much I could drink and how much Xanax I could take to not be too much.
And you're probably making decent money enough to keep things dangerous, right?
Yes.
Well, I was going to ask, when you say you knew how to take enough Xanax to not be hungover, were you aware at this time that taking the Xanax also helped with alcohol withdrawal?
Yes.
Okay.
And I didn't know that. Well, I did not know that, but subconsciously, I think I did.
Yeah.
It was like for me, it was just like, oh, it makes me feel better.
Yeah. I'm not shaky. I'm not sick.
And I never got the shakes. Like if I didn't take it, I never got the shakes. I never felt really bad. I just felt like I had a terrible hangover. But it was just a vicious cycle. It was just, for the next 2 years, it was like just spiraling out of control. I was hanging out with the people that I loved, I pushed away. I was hanging out with a bunch of random friends. I say friends loosely because they weren't friends.
Right.
Back up just a little bit. The December after my grandfather passed away in August, when I moved back home with my grandmother, when I'd been, going back and forth, I was partying here and there, but I still hadn't started back drinking. It was just beer. I was like, if I just drink beer, I'll be okay, And so then it got worse. I started drinking beer and then wine, and then eventually vodka was what I always went back to. December of 2015, I started having these crazy allergic reactions. It's like I'd get hives all over my body. Every time I would have a reaction, they would get worse than the one before, to the point that I became anaphylactic. I had to carry an EpiPen with me. My grandmother took me to one of her friends was a allergist. They did a bunch of tests on me to figure out what it was. Basically, they said it was idiopathic, meaning I got hives and I had allergic reactions, and they had no idea what was causing it. Looking back, the only thing that I did not tell them was the amount of alcohol that I drank. It was literally my body having an allergic reaction to the amount of alcohol I was putting in my body.
Yeah.
So 2015, 2016 was a blur. I just partied and made some money and did all that. And
Still living with your grandmother at that time?
No, I'd moved out. I was living in an apartment at that point, still in Jackson though. And then January was actually New Year's Day of 2017. I was at work. I was in the morning shift, and I remember saying, I don't feel good. The next thing I knew, I was in the hospital, and I'd had a seizure at work. I'd had a seizure because I did not have any Xanax to take that morning, and I was having withdrawals. So I had a seizure. They took me to the hospital. They did all the tests. There was nothing that they could see. They were like, oh, it's just a freak accident. Of course, I'm still not being honest with anybody what I'm doing. That's probably the lowest I'd ever been. I was miserable. I remember being so depressed between January and April that I would just sit on the edge of my bed, and I would be like, all I want to do today is take a shower. And the shower was from like the door from my bed to the bathroom was like between me and Kathryn. Like that's how far it was. And I couldn't do it.
Couldn't get up.
And I would just start drinking again. And then
was your family aware of anything at this point and intervening in any way?
I always hid behind my sister. So side note, my sister is a recovering heroin addict. So it was always obvious that she had the more obvious problem, and mine was just drinking.
So her chaos hid your chaos. I gotcha.
But the whole time, my family saw it.
Yeah.
It was just like, what do you do? I mean, like, what do you do? It's addiction is just so big, and it's, a lot of times you just ignore it. And not saying that my family ignored it, but what do you do? Because I didn't want help, and I was still somewhat functioning. They did whatever they could. I mean, my family was always supportive of me.
Right.
If I needed something, I always could ask my family and they would help. And then I just remember, so in 2017, January of 2017 is when my sister went to the Home of Grace in Mobile. And I remember at that time, there was a lot of hurt between my sister and I. I was angry at her. I was mad because of all the hurt she had caused my family, in and out of treatment. And just, there was a lot of just hurt and anger. It wasn't.
Let me ask you a question about that real quick, because you said that her chaos kind of masked your chaos to the family. But with that statement, it also sounds like her chaos masked your chaos to you.
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
You're sort of really, yeah.
Absolutely. I would be like to my sister, I'd be like, you can't drink at Christmas. Like, you're an addict. Like, like,
You're much worse than I am.
you're much worse than me. Yeah. Oh, I was always pointing fingers at her and telling her about herself.
Yeah.
But and then she would always say, well, look at yourself. I'd be like,
Look
what
at
about
what?
me?
Yeah.
What are we looking at?
I'm maintaining.
Yeah, I'm fine. But yeah, so in 2017, she went, which hopefully one day you can hear her story because it's pretty awesome. But she went to the Home of Grace, and I remember sitting on my bed, and she had been calling for a couple of like the first month or so since she was there. She went like the end of January. She would call, and I would intentionally not answer calls because I was like, I don't want to talk to her. Like, she's not changed. There's nothing different with this rehab than the other ones. Yeah. And of course, most of the time you get to call at night, and I was already drinking, so I was doing other things. And then one time I answered, and we talked for a little while, and I could hear something different in her voice. And then the next time she called, she was like, hey, listen, why don't you just try this place out? Like, it's great. I think you would really like it. Like, you don't even have to worry about anything. Like, I'll be here. I did not know, but every day since the day that my sister got to the Home of Grace, she went to every chapel and she would ask them to pray for me. And she would pray that God would put it on my heart to get sober. And so little did I know that it was God speaking for me and doing for me what I could not do for myself. So I said, all right, I'll try it out.
She literally prayed you in there?
Yeah. So we couldn't be on the program as sisters at the same time. So she graduated on April 3rd, 2017, and that's the day that I checked myself in. And so April 3rd, 2017 is my sobriety date, and it's also my sister's birthday.
Oh, wow.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. So I went to the Home of Grace. I graduated from the Home of Grace. I stayed at the grad dorm for a couple months and started talking back to that ex of mine that had moved my stuff out. He made everything sound really great. So he came and picked me up. I lived in an Oxford house for a month or so in Hattiesburg, and then eventually moved back in with him. Was back living with him. It was good for a couple months, and then it was just mass chaos again. Was
he sober?
Well, I thought he was.
Yeah.
Turns out that one day we were going somewhere, and he got out of his truck, and I looked in the console of his truck, and there's like empty airplane bottles everywhere. And so I confronted him about it, and he was like, you have the problem, not me. So it was one of those things. Yeah. And then after I found it, he just stopped hiding it from me. So yes, he was a full-blown alcoholic.
Yeah.
And I did not know that for the first couple of months. So now here I am, freshly sober, like 8 months sober. And I'm like, what am I going to do? So I remembered at the Home of Grace, get plugged in. That's what you got to do. So I found a home church. I started going to a recovery group. My ex did not like this. He tried pretty much anything he could do to discourage me from going to church or going to my recovery group, because that was giving me a community of support, and he didn't like that because he couldn't isolate me.
Yeah.
At this point, my whole family, they didn't approve of the relationship because they knew what all came along with it, and so they had kind of backed off.
So I want to hear a little bit more about this moment in your life, right? Because that to me is amazing. Because you're living with this gentleman, so clearly he's the strongest influence in your life, right? You're spending the most time with him. Most of these stories end badly there.
I was
right?
thinking the same thing.
There's a relapse, but you make this amazing choice to dig in deeper to your recovery. How in the world did that happen? Surely there's some community around you that you're still attached to that's supporting your recovery. Would that be accurate?
Yes. So my sister and I are best friends.
Okay.
She was still at the grad dorm at the Home of Grace. I still had that. I still had her. Well, actually, she was living she was living in a house at that point owned by a ministry in Mobile. But I still had all my connections at the Home of Grace. I can remember talking to Mike and Sherry a couple of times, talking to Shannon. They would call and pray with me because one thing that I never had after I got sober was cravings for alcohol.
Really?
Anxiety is always the way that the devil has come at me. Like, you know, I can remember actually about when I moved back in with my boyfriend, I can remember I'd just gotten all my stuff out of storage in Jackson and I found a whole bottle of Xanax. And it was just like in my face. And I was around at that point, I was around alcohol every day, and the alcohol didn't bother me, but I was like, oh, wow. You know, like, here's a bottle of Xanax. Like, for me, it was like the devil knew if he put it in front of me, like that was going to be a temptation.
How'd you sidestep that one?
I immediately called my sister.
Amen.
And I said, you got to be on the phone with me. I've got to flush these. Like, I was freaking out.
Through all of this, I'm tagging on to you, and that's what I was thinking. The majority of the stories that you hear when they move back in with the man, it usually starts with a man. Well, then they have an excuse to drink.
Yeah.
And they give in.
Yeah.
Then the alcohol didn't work. You didn't get tripped up with that. Then you find the Xanax, but you used all the tools you were given.
Yeah.
And we have a choice to use them, and you chose to use them. You stayed in contact, and you started doing the next right thing. Even if it didn't look maybe like everybody else thought it should, you didn't just give up.
No, I didn't. And I think a lot of it for me is I was so determined. I'm very hard-headed, but a lot of times in that relationship, there was harsh words. You'll never be anything without me. You're the problem. I'm not. You know, I can drink. You can't. Like, you're the one that's messed up your life. I haven't.
So emotionally and mentally abusive.
Yeah. At some point, I just remember during that season of my life, I was closer to God than I've ever been. I was laying in my bed one night and I was journaling and I was just praying like, God, why can't you just bless this relationship? And it was clear as day, like he was sitting in this room and God said, I can't bless something I'm not the center of.
Wow.
And I knew at that point, all right, you've given me my answer. Now I have to get out. So how do I get out? Because the vehicle that I had belonged to him. We lived in a house that was, you know, next door to his mom's place. You know, the job I had, I'd gone back working at the restaurant they owned. It was all everything. It was like
Connected
I was stuck.
to him.
Wow.
And it was like I couldn't get out. At this point, my grandmother was not helping me get back out of this. She was.
You had burned that bridge temporarily.
I had, but she had also moved to Atlanta at this point. My uncle had moved. My grandmother made the decision to move to a retirement community over there, and my uncle kind of stepped in at that point, and he was like, "No longer are you going to put this on my mother. She's not going to save you." And which good for him. I needed that. I had that tough love from him, and I still have that tough love from him today, and I am beyond grateful for that. So I just remember, like, what am I going to do? And then my sister and I were given an opportunity to go share our testimonies in Philadelphia, Mississippi at a recovery place with some friends that I knew. I'd been there. And actually on my way back, I remember calling Barry Walker, who owns the river in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and it's a recovery place. And I remember saying, Barry, like, I've got to get out of this relationship. What do I do? And he was like, we're going to figure it out together. So he and his wife and then two other people, they were all praying for me. My sister was praying for me. Everybody at the Home of Grace is praying for me. Like, all right, God, let's let's figure this out. So I start trying to save money, and every time I would start saving money, something would come up, whether it be my boyfriend would find it because I worked in the waitress, I was a waitress, so it was cash. He would find it or whatever. Like, I just need to get enough money to save up for a car of my own, and then I can get out. I could go stay with my sister for a couple of weeks and then move back to Mobile, get a job, then save up, get out, get an apartment, whatever. Every time I would get ahead, it was like, it wouldn't happen. And I was like, gosh, like, what is happening? And then finally one Thursday night, we were standing in the kitchen. My ex said that he was actually coming to the coast. He was going fishing with his dad. My vehicle was broken down, and he was going to literally leave me there all weekend without a vehicle to go have fun. And for me, I was sitting there and I just looked at him. I said, I'm leaving you. And he said, who cares about you enough to come pick you up?
Wow.
And I say the one person that he disliked more than anybody, which was my Uncle Clark. That was a lie. My Uncle Clark was not coming to get me. But I said that. He left. He went and stayed in the guest cabin, like down the thing. Didn't talk to me again. Got his mom to call and ask when I was going to be out. The next 12 hours were literally the most seamless, like, everything lined up. Everything was from God. I had met a woman at church that had an empty room at her son's house that I could store all of my furniture. She also had a truck that had a trailer that we could do to get all the stuff out of my house. I didn't have to pay for storage. She said it could stay there literally for however long I need it. As a matter of fact, I just went back last weekend to pick up my last 2 pictures that I had at her house. Here we are 6 years later. So everything just worked perfectly. Got everything. My sister came and picked me up, put everything in her car. It was me, my sister, all my stuff, and my dog. And we went to Mobile. I stayed with her. Some connections from the Home of Grace got me in touch with Tasha Ridley. Tasha runs the Pasco home in Simmons, Alabama. So I talked to her. They're like, call her, see what's up. How much does it cost to get in? Well, when I called Barry Walker, the guy that owns the river, and I told him that I was leaving and I'd gotten out, he said, we're going to send you some money. We want to help you. It's not much, but we just want to help you just a little bit. I did not have a penny to my name at this point. Barry Walker sent me a check for $200, and it was $150 to get into Pasco.
Wow.
And so I checked into Pasco, and at that point, I said I would never start over again. I said I would never get myself into a situation that I depended on a man or anyone besides God. I did not know what it was going to look like. I didn't know what my life was going to look like, but I knew that he was going to provide for me.
Right.
So I moved.
He had opened every door.
Yeah, every door. So I moved to Pasco. It's a 9-month program. I was there 2 weeks after I graduate from Pasco. I find out that I'm pregnant. I had no idea what I was going to do. I was living in a faith-based, sober living home. I had been going around, like the face of Pasco, giving my testimony, doing all the things right, getting plugged into my church, very involved in my church in Mobile. Had a great support system, had a great mentor, doing all the things right. But somewhere along the way, I slipped.
Yeah.
And so when I found out I was pregnant, I hid it. I was like, okay, here we go again. EC's going to figure this out. Yeah. So I had a job at the time, actually 2 weeks after I got to the home, not to the Home of Grace, to Pasco. I met a lady at church. We were talking about what I did. I told her how I worked for a law firm for all those years, paralegal work. And she was like, well, let me have your resume. So she called me and she was like, hey, I have this job. It's weird. It starts on a Saturday, but I think that you might be good at it. That's when Hurricane Michael hit. Insurance adjusting. I don't know if you know anything about it, but storms are pretty big in the insurance adjusting
It's the right
world.
time to get into that.
So I got in. Long story short, I still am I'm an insurance adjuster now. I'm a claims manager, but started working for that company as a temp. They hired me on full time. They closed that company down, and the owners took me with them to a new company where I am now. So that was
That's
also
awesome.
all God. Everything about that.
Wow.
I never had to interview for my job. To this day, I haven't had to interview. And I've never had to ask for a raise, and God has always provided. So I was at Pasco, found out that I'm pregnant, and tell Tasha, well, I'm trying to figure everything out. Every time I tried to figure something out, God was like, nope, I can do it. And so my mom and my sister knew. Finally, I can remember like driving down the road. I was like, I got to tell Tasha, but I can't. They asked me to be the house mother. And I was like, no, I can't do that. Knowing I'm pregnant. No, I can't do that. I don't think it's a good fit for me. I'm planning on moving soon. I'm trying to find some houses, all this. And then Tasha, one thing about Tasha is she prays about something for 7 days before she asks you about it.
That's awesome. That's
So
good.
we were in her office one night for like 2 hours talking. She's like, God, please just tell me what's wrong with EC. Something's going on. It's not normal. And she couldn't figure it out. The next day, I go back in her office. She sits down, and she said, literally, she sits in her chair, and God says, she's pregnant. She said, not EC, like this can't be true, like not her. So she asked me, she said, are you pregnant? And I broke down. I said, yes, I'm pregnant. I'm having a little boy. I mean,
You were real pregnant.
I knew it, but I was still hiding it.
Yeah.
So she was like, all right, what are we going to do? And I was like, well, I would love to stay, because every time that I try to leave something happens. And God's obviously trying to tell me something. And so she went and asked Philip, there's a men and a women's, and Philip owns all of them, and Tasha runs the women's. And that was on a Friday. She asked him, he was like, I'm gonna have to get back to you on this. Like, he didn't know what just hit him.
Yeah.
And so Monday, he's like, all right. And she's like, are you kicking her out? And he's like, kicking her out? Like, no, I'm not kicking her out. And his words were, I knew I wanted to open a women's and children's home. I just didn't know it was for EC. So I kicked Philip and Rocky out of their house, which is like the women's facility was like a church. So the house behind the women's facility was where they lived. I kicked them out, and we turned it into a women's and children's home. I stayed there the whole time I was pregnant. I never once had to buy anything. I had all of the ladies from all the different churches throw me baby showers. They bought me everything I could possibly need. I mean, literally, Blake is now 4, and I had clothes up to 3T. That's how much stuff that I had.
Yeah.
And just over and beyond. And I can just remember when I got pregnant, my mom was like, what are you going to do? And I was like, I don't know, but God does.
Amen.
And for the first time in my life, I had to truly depend on him. I had to say, like, I don't know, but I know that he does.
And I don't have to figure it out.
And I don't
because he
have to
will.
figure it out. And I just had this peace about me. Like, my whole pregnancy, I just, my mom will say now, like, you never got scared. And I was like, well, of course I did. But at the same time, like, the uncertainty, but I mean, God is constant. And that's the only thing I knew I had to worry about. So
Reminds me of the biblical definition of peace, which is the peace which surpasses understanding, right? When things are chaotic, it doesn't seem to belong there. And yet it sounds like you had that.
Yeah. And that's where God wanted to get me. It was like, all right, I'm going to take you back to this. I'm going to allow you to go to this relationship, and you're going to depend on me. And then, but you're still going to try to figure it out for yourself. And then you're going to get pregnant, and you're going to try to figure it out by yourself again. But then you're finally going to surrender
everything.
And then when I finally surrendered, it was just like everything ever since then. It's just been nothing but God. And I've never looked back. And I stayed at Pasco. I had Blake at Pasco. I stayed there until he was a year and a half. And then a door opened for me to move to Ocean Springs. And that was just God slinging a door open and saying, here you go. It's time you can move. And so we moved here in 2021, and I've never looked back.
Before we go any further, let's take a minute to address the man or the woman listening to today's episode and wishing for a better life. Or maybe addiction has completely overtaken a family member or a friend.
You are not alone. As you may know, the Jesus Loves Addicts podcast is produced by the Home of Grace, a Christ-centered addiction recovery program in South Mississippi with over 60 years of experience.
The Home of Grace has residential programs ranging from 30 days to 12 months. With 2 separate campuses for men and women, they are fully staffed with caring individuals who want nothing more than to guide you to a life of recovery.
Services include individual and group counseling, marriage and family counseling, classes, workshops, GED, and workforce training, all grounded in biblical principles.
And because of donations from the community, the cost of the program is incredibly affordable.
Thousands of alumni from all across the country can tell you there is no other program in the world quite like the Home of Grace.
If you want to start a new path to recovery, don't wait. Speak with their admissions specialist today. Visit homeofgrace.org or call 833-55-GRACE to talk with someone.
That's 833-55-GRACE. Call the Home of Grace today. I want to ask you something. You said ever since then it's been nothing but God.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's hard. It's hard.
That's what I was going to ask you. Somebody might hear that and go, well, what does that mean? Life is perfect, but it doesn't mean that, does it?
So that's another thing. Blake's father's not in his life. He's never met him. He's not on the birth certificate. It's probably a blessing. I am, when I say I'm a single mom, I'm not just a single mom that has weekends off. I'm an only parent.
Yeah.
So I don't get to turn off that mom mode. I'm mom and dad.
All the time.
All the time. But he's the greatest thing in the whole world. Of course, like, do I want a family one day? Absolutely. But I have no intentions of opening that door until it's the one that I know God has sent. Just like he has opened every other door, he's going to open that door too.
Amen.
And you work a lot, don't you?
Yeah, I do. I work. And that's kind of, I do. But I love my job.
Right.
But I can also sometimes work as much as I want to not have to deal with certain things, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I can bury myself in my work real easily. Like, I can do that. But I've gotten a lot better.
You have family here? I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, my mom.
Okay. All right.
My mom's here.
I thought that, but I wasn't sure.
Yes, my mom is here. And she is she's my son's favorite person. That's his KK. She gives him whatever he wants. And she is the biggest help. We lived with her for the first 6 months after I had him too.
Okay.
So that was another thing. We were here for 6 months and then went back to Mobile. But yes, I have her. She's the biggest help.
So I want to ask you about the statement you just made about you can bury yourself in work, right? Because one of the things we want to do here is talk about not just the difficulties of addiction and make it look like suddenly in recovery, like we just talked about, suddenly everything's perfect. That's not the case, right? Life is hard. And anything can become an addiction. Addiction is just simply looking for an answer where there is no answer, right? We look for it in drugs and sex and gambling and whatever it is. Do you think work, when you, and I don't know that this is the case, but when you bury yourself in work, is that serving as one of those things? Is that an addiction for you?
It was for a while, especially like when I first found out I was pregnant. That was something that I could do because I could work a whole lot. And I could work not only at that point I was working from the office, but I could also work remote. So I would go to work all day and then come back and I would be on call. I chose to be on call, but it was the way that I could kind of bury myself and not have to think. It was kind of like, I know God's in control, but if I just don't think about it, then he's going to figure it out for me.
Yeah.
So that's kind of more of a distraction for me. Honestly, more of a distraction for me not to worry.
Yeah, so I really like that and just want to kind of highlight that because we want to be good workers, right? We want to be good friends. We want to be good people, but anything can be an addiction. And you just said, for me, it was a way not to think. So burying yourself in work, which we want to be good at, though, became a detriment, really, because it stopped you from having to work through issues because you didn't have to think about them.
Yeah.
Right. So,
and I will say, when I was pregnant, the entire time that I was pregnant, I met with a couple from Mobile. We did some intense, and very intense, like prayer counseling and some inner healing and everything. They are 85 and 90 years old. I still talk to them to this day. Every couple months, we'll have a Zoom prayer session. If I'm having anxiety come back up, or if I'm just having a hard time and I need to just talk to Jesus, we get on the phone and we just pray it out.
A lot of wisdom there. So how do you handle anxiety now?
Just pray about it.
Yeah.
I'll have to say anxiety does not control my life anymore. It is something that I know is covered by the blood, and God has healed me from that.
Yeah. So would it be fair to say it's not the absence of anxiety? You still feel it at times.
Oh, yeah.
It's just
it doesn't consume me.
Yeah, there you go. I love that. And what a great look at recovery too, right?
Yeah.
Recovery is not the absence of difficulty. It's the ability to handle it in a constructive way rather than a destructive way, right? Yeah. So really powerful. Let me ask you another question, because your story of recovery is just got God cloaked all over it. And I love that. If we go back pre-recovery, I didn't hear a lot of, I know you were raised in this wonderful family. Were there faith seeds planted back then?
Absolutely. I grew up in church. I have an uncle that's
perhaps you mentioned that.
I have an uncle that's a preacher.
Oh, okay.
Like we were in church every Sunday, whether we wanted to be or not. Even when I got to be older, like in college, if we were out drinking at the bar, my grandmother expected us to be on the front row that Sunday.
Yeah.
So yes, I grew up in a very, very healthy Christian home. My family was always in church. I mean, there was nothing, I will say, growing up, I kind of felt like my grandmother, I could get to heaven by my grandmother's faith.
If only.
Yeah. That's the kind of way it was kind of like, well, my whole family's saved, so that means I'm saved too.
I must be.
Yeah, it was one of those kind of things. But I think definitely when my dad got sick, all that anger and all that hurt, was I mad at God? Absolutely. And it's kind of one of those things where it wasn't that I didn't have father figures in my life, but it's kind of one of those things like, they say a lot of times your relationship with God's kind of like the relationship with your father. So my father was absent because he was taken from us. He left this world too soon, but he was absent from my life. And so God was kind of absent from my life. He was there. He was always in the background, but I never really called on him until it was something like a big problem.
Yeah. Please help now.
Yeah.
Please
help me.
Would it be fair to say, with that connection to your father, maybe you didn't trust God?
Yes.
Yeah.
Kind of like, why did you let this happen? That was what it was.
How do you see that answer now?
I believe that everything happens for a reason. I believe we live in a fallen world. I believe that my dad would not come back for anything in this world, and I know that I'll see him again. Yeah.
Amen. That part of your answer, that we live in a fallen world, I really like, because, and I don't want to, what you said, I think a lot of people say that everything happens for a reason. I'm not sure I'm in that camp. I think sometimes just things happen because we live in a fallen world, right? Yeah. And he's still there, though. He's still there and waiting. And there is maybe that's the thing. There is a reason behind it all. Maybe that's right. There is going to be an end to the pain and the suffering.
Absolutely. And I'll say, in my prayer and all of the therapy that I went through, it was some tough stuff. I mean, so we had to work out a lot of stuff. The one thing that we would do is Barbara Turner, she would say, all right, let's go back to that situation. Let's go back when your dad was sick. Let's go back to the day your dad died. What does it look like? All right, now let's find Jesus in that situation. and I found Jesus. And so I didn't have to continue to go back there because I just turned my head and looked to where Jesus was. And I saw him in that situation. And for me, that brought healing.
Yeah.
That's powerful.
Yeah.
How old is your son now?
4.
4. How is that transferring? I'm just curious right now. I'm just curious as a father too. How is that transferring to him? How do you do things with your son similarly or differently than
you were raised?
When I was raised.
Because it was a good home life,
Yeah,
right?
it was. I mean, he knows that he's loved. My prayer is that he never has that abandonment issue, but I can pray that off all day long because I know God's going to bring a man that is going to love me and love that baby as his own and be his father. I know he's going to step up and be that father. Right now, I just surround him with love. I mean, we go to church. We go to Centerpoint Church, which is the best church in the whole world. And Blake loves going to church. I mean, he knows Wednesdays and Sundays we're at church. And if we don't go, he's like, why aren't we at church? But for me, I just have to teach him that Jesus is love. And at the end of the day, if he sees that, then I think I'm setting him up for success.
Yeah.
I'd have to agree.
Yeah.
Well, before we started, I know that the audience wouldn't know, but our producer's prayer was that it's not be about your testimony, anything about you as an individual, but that we see God in it.
Yeah.
And Paul even said it, like God's all in your story, all over your story, like without a doubt. So
Absolutely.
I'd say that prayer was answered.
I always say when I'm giving my testimony or when I'm trying to sum it up that, it's like my testimony is one of grace and the goodness of God.
Amen.
Yeah.
So I ask this question a lot, and I know it's such a podcasty question, but it's significant, I think, right? Somebody out there is listening and hears your story and wants to relate to it, but just feels like they can't. What would you say to that person struggling and who, yeah, that's great, she was able to do it, but, right? What would you say to this person?
If God did it for me, he'll do it for you too. He's not a respecter of persons.
What a great statement. He's not a respecter of persons. That works in so many ways. The way you just meant it was much more graceful, right? That he will extend himself to whoever will submit himself. But it's also true. There's a similar statement about addiction that it is.
Yes,
that it
addiction
is no respecter of persons.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so here you are, raised in a perfect home, right? People scratching their heads. How did this happen?
Absolutely.
Because it doesn't always happen the same, right? We're exposed to things. We live in a fallen world. It comes around. And so the fall and the resurrection are not unique to anyone.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So, wow. Well, EC, really, really appreciate your story. And I think we had, one of the things I love about this is we had a lot of opportunity to really hear the recovery side of your story, which is so important. I feel like sometimes we get lost in the addictive part of the story, but here we heard so much of God's movement in your life.
And what that process looked like for you.
And still looks like.
Absolutely. I remember when I got pregnant, Philip that owns Pasco, he actually told me, he said, God doesn't make mistakes. He said, look at the audience that you can now reach. Before you couldn't relate to people that were mothers, and now you can.
Okay.
Yeah, he uses our wounds.
Yeah.
Right? He really does. Now, that's not to say for anybody listening that you have to accumulate as many as you can, right? It's just,
don't recommend it. Yeah. Just surrender the first time.
Exactly.
Stop trying to figure it out yourself.
Yes.
He can also use our strengths, by the way. So, and he'll use them all. So maybe last, so what has been your greatest hurdle in recovery? What do you think has been the, since on this side of the fence, what's been your greatest hurdle?
Staying sober, raising a child on my own.
Yeah.
But I say on my own, but people always say, how do you do it? And I'll say, it's not me, it's Jesus.
Yeah. And one of the things that I've heard, it sounds like you have done a really amazing job of reaching out and asking for help when you need it. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Yeah.
I learned that.
Yeah.
I learned that, asking for help is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of wisdom.
It's a shame that we have to learn that, right? That should be almost innate, but we all have to learn that. It does feel like a weakness for some reason, right?
Right.
For this reason, the flesh, right? And we feel like it's, So, well, you see, your story is full of God's strength in the midst of our weaknesses. And really, really appreciate you being here. And as with everybody, your vulnerability. And boy, we'll be praying for you. And I take a lot of strength from your story. I hope that you take a lot of strength from EC's story. I'm just always, again, just enamored with who sits in these seats and comes so honest and raw. And by the way, you may have a story, and we invite you to go to JesusLovesAddicts.com. And if you do have a story, please leave your testimony. We'd love to talk to you. We'd love to hear about it. If you have questions, comments, let us know. And by all means, if there's somebody that that can benefit from, these stories, man, they're beauty from ashes. And that's God's story. And if you know somebody who can just benefit from that and receive that, as can't we all, right? I still do every time. I get the benefit of reaping that reward every week. And so if you know somebody, please let them know about this podcast and tune in. And so thank you guys so much. And we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you all.